Okay, first question. What do
Mm-hmm.
you recall about life, like, before 9/11? Were you traveling by plane a lot? Did, like, security at airport, what security at airports was like? Any terrorist behaviors?
3 months before September 11th, it was, I think it was weeks before, and like in June or July, Dad and I flew on our first plane ride, well, my first plane ride, out to Seattle, and it was a very long flight, and I don't remember going through any type of extraordinary security measures. You kind of just checked in, checked your bags. You had to walk through a metal detector, but nothing like a pat down, nothing like that. And then that was my very first flight, and the steward, the airline steward, found out it was my first flight, and he moved us to first class, so he moved our seats for us. So we got to go into first class, and after we landed, I was actually allowed, they took me into the cockpit, and Dad has a picture of me sitting in the cockpit of the airplane. And as soon as September 11th happened, which was about 6 to 8 weeks later, a long flight, they chose long flights because they would be full of fuel. Security was just locked down completely. So,
Were you scared of being attacked before 9/11?
no.
Like, why or why not?
No. I wasn't, because nobody had used an airplane as a weapon. And terrorist attacks were something that happened in other countries, not in ours, at the time. In Middle East. I don't want to say other countries. It was mostly the Middle East.
Did you ever visit any of the locations of the 9/11 attack? Like, what do you remember, if you did visit?
I have never visited. Dad has. Dad was on business, and he did see the Twin Tower Memorial. But no, I have not. I've not had the privilege, because it really and truly is a privilege to go pay your respects there.
How did you find out, like, about the attacks? Like, where were you? What were you doing at the time? Like, were you at school, work?
I
Like,
remember everything in explicit detail. I was at Seaholm High School. I was working the front office, and I was thought I was pregnant, but it wasn't. And my boss said, "I'm leaving for a meeting," and I said, "Okay." And no more than 20 minutes, maybe 10, the principal, his name is Mr. Piper, Terry Piper, and he was going to be going to the board office, which is probably 10 minutes away. And he called right after he left and said, "Something's happened in New York. See if you can get a TV hooked up in the office and see what it's about." And so we did. And then he called back a few minutes later and said, there is definitely something going on. I'm not sure I'm going to be going to the meeting. Said, "Do you have the TV?" And I said, "Yep, technology's coming right now to hook it up." And as soon as we turned on the TV, we witnessed the second plane hitting the South Tower. And then within seconds, he called. He said, "I'm on my way back. Go to lockdown." And that was horrific. Pushed the button and went to lockdown. And it was a very scary moment across the United States.
What were your like first feelings, emotions when you heard about the attacks?
Fear, grief, uh, unknowing, because they weren't over. Because there was so much information coming out so fast, about the diversion of planes, other planes that had been hijacked, that were no longer on radar. One hit the Pentagon, two hit the, and one went into the ground in Pennsylvania.
Were you like with other people when you heard about the attacks? What do you
Yes.
remember about sharing that moment?
I do remember sharing that moment with Michelle Ducato. I remember what I was wearing. Michelle was the other secretary. She had a son who was in New York at the time, and he immediately called her and said, "I'm okay." And he was on his way out of the city. This was before the collapse even. And she broke down because she said she had this horrific thought that, oh my gosh, we're going to war and my son is going to have to go fight a war. And I do remember my phone lighting up and trying to calm the fears of the parents. So afraid for their children, wanting to know what we were doing, letting them know we were on lockdown. It was just horrific.
Like what is your most vivid memory of that day?
Of that day? Well, there's two. Seeing the plane hit the second tower, and then getting a phone call from a colleague's mother, and she was very solemn, and she asked to speak with Lou, who was a teacher, and something told me, ask her if it's regarding today's events. So I did, because she had used the word imperative that I speak with Lou. And I said, okay, Mrs. Pavlov. And I asked her if it had anything to do with today's events and if somebody should be with him when she spoke with him. And she kind of broke, her voice broke, and she said yes. And his brother was on Flight 93. And he perished, he died. And that was just awful, knowing that, you know, it just became, the world became very, very, very small. Because everybody, the entire United States, the entire world was focused. And it was literally happening live. It was a very odd thing.
Were you afraid for your safety, for your family's safety, for people around, for like the people around you's safety? Like, what actions did you take or anything?
No. I wasn't, because I had complete confidence that we were in a safe space, that we were on lockdown, and truthfully my only thought was to keep the students safe and try to calm them, because they were frightened, because they did have cell phones and their cell phones were going off and their parents were calling. And there were TVs, and it's not like the technology today, but there certainly were TVs and all that stuff, So, yeah. But my biggest concern, I wasn't fearful, but I was just very trying to keep the students calm and helping wherever I could to do that.
Were you personally connected to anyone in the towers, Pentagon, or planes? Like, what happened to them if you were connected to anybody?
No, I was not personally connected, other than through Mr. Pavlov, who was the teacher, and his brother. And another teacher's daughter had just started college in New York City. And,
Wait, here. Now you can go.
So I wasn't personally, but I saw people who had people in the thick of it. And that's what I mean when the world was very small that day.
What do you remember about the nation and its leaders, like, coming together in the days following the September 11th?
I remember watching the news, and at the time it was CNN, was the one that was most connected. I remember seeing President Bush being told about the attacks while he was reading to children in an elementary classroom. And he was approached by his Secret Service and told there was an attack. And then he was approached by something, then he had to cut his visit short. And the next thing I remember was our government went into like an emergency mode. And President Bush went on Air Force One and was diverted. And then Dick Cheney was taken to a bunker as being second in command. Our Speaker of the House was literally taken out of chambers and rushed to another location because it was our system of government, so that if something were to happen to President Bush or the Vice President, then there's the Speaker of the House. So all these people were safe so that they could run our government. And I do remember a rumor was flying around, but they believe that was Flight 93 where Lou's brother passed. They do believe that plane was headed for the Capitol. And that's where all of our representatives were. And so they evacuated that. And then, of course, the plane hit the Pentagon and it was chaos. But I never felt like our leaders weren't in control. Never felt like that. I mean, I remember F-15s flying over from a Selfridge. I remember hearing those. And they were patrolling. They were everywhere. I do remember that.
What did you think of, the government's reaction to the attacks in the days and months, after the attacks?
I think the government's reaction, I think you saw a great cohesiveness. They came together. There was no Republican. There was no Democrat. I think that it was used to go after Saddam Hussein in the Iraq War because he was considered a terrorist. There was a lot of verbiage using the word evil as it relates to his reign of power. He actually coined the term, President George Bush coined the term axis of evil. And he included Iran, Afghanistan, Iraq.
How did you feel about the decision to invade Afghanistan?
We didn't invade Afghanistan.
You didn't? Okay.
We invaded Iraq.
Okay. Well, that's what one of my questions said.
I don't think we invaded
Well, then how do you feel about that? Why?
I'm not sure that was the right course of action, sending our troops to the ground. Wait, I'm thinking of Kuwait. Two different things. Yes, we did go into Afghanistan. And at the time I thought, if we can catch them and get and catch the people that did this and bring them to justice, then yes. But I don't think we completely understood fighting a war of religion is very different than fighting a war of land. We didn't want their land. We wanted them gone.
Mm-hmm. How have the additional security measures at airports made you feel?
Well, I think it's been quite selective. I remember the second time I flew was with 2 4-year-olds, you and Richard. And I thought it was ridiculous that they made you take off your shoes and they wouldn't let you go with me, and you were crying and Richard was crying, and you had to walk through the security by yourself, through the little metal detector by yourself, and you were all crying, and it was just awful. And I said, this is ridiculous. They're 4. She's carrying Dora, he's carrying Diego. Really? And yeah, your little shoes and everything else had to come off, and they had to go through. They actually went through your play bags. We had these little bags we bought, purple and blue, and we got them for the plane. And we did that on purpose so that you could have toys with you on the plane, because you were, you know. And they even dumped out all your toys that you had lovingly put in the bag, because this was your first plane ride. We were on our way to Disney World. So, I think they went a bit over the top.
How have the government's actions